I always try to operate from the do no harm. That is always my intention.
Gail King had learned something very early in life that most people only understand much later, if they understand it at all. And that is the idea that stability is often an illusion carefully constructed from the outside, while something far more complex is unfolding within. By the time the public came to know her as a calm, composed presence on television, someone who could sit across from chaos and never lose her center, she had already spent decades building that composure, layer by layer, experience by experience, moment by moment. And yet, if you trace everything back, if you follow the line all the way to its origin, you eventually arrive at a single moment in time that refuses to fade. A moment so precise that it does not blur with memory, but instead sharpens with it, becoming clearer, heavier, more permanent as the years pass. She could tell you the exact minute her life split into before and after. Not approximately, not vaguely, exactly. 9:16 p.m. There's something almost mathematical about that kind of precision, like a fixed point on a graph where everything changes direction, where the slope of a life suddenly shifts, and nothing that comes after can ever fully return to what came before. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a recalibration, a sudden realization that the equation she thought she was solving had variables she didn't even know existed. That night in 1990 didn't just end a marriage, it introduced a kind of awareness that doesn't go away, the kind that sits quietly in the background of every future decision, every relationship, every moment of trust. And what makes it more complicated, more layered, more difficult to simplify, is that it wasn't just about betrayal in the obvious sense. It was about proximity. It was about familiarity. It was about realizing that the people closest to you can exist in two completely different realities at the same time, one that they show you and one that they live without you ever seeing it. And once you see that, once you understand that duality, it changes how you move through the world. But long before that night, long before Hartford and marriage and television studios, Gail's life had already been shaped by a different kind of displacement, one that didn't come from betrayal, but from geography, culture, and identity. She was born into a world that, on paper, looked structured and secure. Chevy Chase, Maryland carried a reputation of order, affluence, predictability, the kind of place where life is expected to follow a certain pattern, where deviation stands out more than it blends in. And as a young black girl growing up in that environment, she learned very quickly that difference is not always subtle. Sometimes it's the first thing people notice, the first thing they react to, the first thing that defines how you are seen before you even have a chance to define yourself. And then, just as she was beginning to understand that environment, it was taken away. At 6 years old, she was moved across the world to Ankara, Turkey, a transition so abrupt that it must have felt less like relocation and more like being dropped into an entirely different coordinate system. Imagine being that young and suddenly everything you recognize, language, culture, rhythm, even the soundscape of daily life changes all at once. The call to prayer echoing through the streets, markets filled with unfamiliar energy, conversations happening in languages you don't yet understand. It's the kind of shift that forces adaptation, not gradually, but immediately. And adaptation, when it happens that early, doesn't just teach flexibility, it builds awareness. Because when you are constantly the one who stands out, you start paying attention differently. You observe more, you listen more carefully. You learn how to read subtle cues, how to adjust your behavior depending on the environment, how to find your place even when there isn't an obvious one waiting for you. These are not skills most children consciously develop, but they become second nature when you grow up in that kind of in-between space. From first grade through sixth grade, Gail lived in that tension between belonging and not belonging, between familiarity and difference, between who she was and how the world around her interpreted that identity. And that kind of upbringing does something interesting to a person. It doesn't just make them resilient, it makes them perceptive in a way that is difficult to teach later in life. When she eventually returned to the United States, you might expect that things would feel stable again, that returning home would mean returning to comfort. But that's not how identity works after it's been stretched across cultures. She came back different, not visibly, not in a way that could be easily explained, but internally. Her perspective had expanded, her experiences didn't match those of the people around her, and instead of feeling like she had come home, she felt slightly out of sync with the place that was supposed to be familiar. So she did what many people do in that situation. She adjusted. She refined how she presented herself. She learned when to speak about certain experiences and when to hold them back. She found ways to blend in without completely losing who she was. And in doing that, she developed something that would later become one of her defining traits: the ability to connect with people while simultaneously understanding what it feels like to be separate from them. That dual awareness is not common. It's the kind of thing that can't be taught in a classroom, can't be memorized, can't be practiced artificially. It comes from lived experience, from navigating spaces where you don't fully fit and learning how to exist within them anyway. By the time she reached college, her path didn't look like it was leading towards television at all. Psychology made sense. It was structured. It was practical. It aligned with that observant nature she had developed over the years. Understanding people, analyzing behavior, studying patterns of thought, it all fit together logically. But life rarely follows a straight line, and sometimes the most important shifts happen not because of a long-term plan, but because of a single opportunity that reveals something you didn't know you were looking for. That opportunity came in the form of a part-time job, not glamorous, not high profile, just a position at a television station where the work was mostly behind the scenes, where the responsibilities were small, almost invisible to anyone watching from the outside. But inside that environment, something clicked. There's a certain energy in a newsroom that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. It's fast, unpredictable, constantly shifting. Information flows in, decisions are made quickly, and everything operates under the pressure of time. And for someone like Gail, who had spent years observing, analyzing, understanding people and situations, that environment wasn't overwhelming. It was engaging. It was alive in a way that felt different from anything else she had experienced. And once you feel that kind of alignment, it's difficult to ignore. So the path changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, step by step, decision by decision, she moved closer to a career that hadn't been part of the original plan, but felt increasingly like the right direction. And as she moved through different roles, different cities, different stages of her career, she carried with her all the things she had learned long before she ever stepped in front of a camera. The awareness, the adaptability, the ability to read a room, the understanding of human behavior. And then, somewhere along that trajectory, her personal life began to take shape alongside her professional one. Marriage, children, stability, at least on the surface. It's interesting how life can appear balanced from the outside, while something entirely different is happening beneath that surface. Because from a distance, everything looked like it was working: a growing career, a family, a future that seemed structured and secure. But the truth about structure is that it depends entirely on the strength of what holds it together. And sometimes those foundations are not as solid as they appear. That's what made that night in 1990 so significant, not just because of what happened, but because of what it revealed. It wasn't the beginning of something breaking, it was the moment when the break became visible. And visibility changes everything, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. She tried to stay. That part is important, because it speaks to something deeper than just reaction. It speaks to effort, to the willingness to repair, to the desire to hold on to something that once felt real. But there are certain kinds of damage that don't respond to effort in the way people hope they will. Trust is one of them. Once it fractures, it doesn't just affect the present, it reshapes how the future is approached. And that reshaping is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's the difference between fully believing someone and holding back just a fraction. Sometimes it's the awareness that even the most familiar situations can contain unknown variables. And over time, those small shifts accumulate. They become part of how you think, how you feel, how you navigate relationships and decisions and opportunities. So when people later saw Gail King sitting across from difficult interviews, handling intense moments with a kind of calm that seemed almost unshakable, what they were really seeing was not just professional training. They were seeing the result of lived experience. They were seeing someone who had already learned how to remain steady when something destabilizing happens. They were seeing someone who understood that reacting emotionally is not always the most effective response, that sometimes control comes from stillness rather than movement. And that understanding didn't come from television, it came from life. Years later, as her career reached a point where stepping away became a real consideration, that same underlying story remained present, even if it wasn't always visible. Because success doesn't erase the past, it doesn't rewrite it, it doesn't remove the moments that shaped how you think and feel. It just builds on top of them. And when she began to step back, to shift away from the role that had defined such a significant portion of her public life, people naturally looked for explanations in the present: contracts, timing, career evolution. But the deeper explanation wasn't in a single decision, it was in the accumulation of everything that came before. Because a life is not defined by one moment alone.